When we talk about the great navigations, we almost always hear the same explanation for why. They started the search for spices, gold, and new trade routes. But that's the superficial part of the story. Behind the Portuguese and Spanish caravels, there still survived a deeply medieval ideal, which did not point to America or India, but to Jerusalem. In the 15th century, the Iberian king still spoke of crusades. The military orders financed maritime expansion, and navigators promised that their voyages would help to recover the Holy Land. And what few people imagine is that a king of Portugal sent letters to mobilize Christendom for a crusade, or that the kings of Spain literally began to adopt the title of King of Jerusalem. But after all, how was this possible? How did Portugal and Spain, at the far west of Europe, plan to reconquer Jerusalem? What was the reality in the relationship of these kings with the Crusades? And how would the discovery of the Americas help in this endeavor? To understand why Jerusalem was still so present in the Iberian imagination of the 15th century, we need to go back a few centuries in time. The Crusades were not isolated military expeditions, but a long historical process that shaped the politics, religiosity, and imagination of European Christendom. Through the gathering of nobles and knights from all over Europe, the Christians conquered and established the kingdom of Jerusalem there. More than just the kingdom, transnational military orders emerged, responsible for protecting pilgrims and maintaining the Christian presence in the holy places. And while Jerusalem was the symbolic center of these crusades, the Iberian Peninsula was experiencing its own war, the War of the Reconquista against the Moors, which spanned the entire Middle Ages. But the moment when the relationship between the Crusades and the voyages intensifies comes after the end of the Order of the Templars in the 14th century. While all of Europe was destroying the Templars, the Pope authorizes Portugal to welcome the order under the protection of the crown, transforming it into the Order of Christ. This order followed the ideal of conquest and crusade. In its expansions through Alema, it became the largest and most important order in Portugal, conquering important positions and cities in North Africa. And so, many times when the Portuguese launched exploratory expeditions in the Atlantic, the sails bore the cross of the order, the successor of the Templars. And it was while this order was growing in its expansionism that great changes were happening in European politics. While the Portuguese navigations were reaching the coasts of Guinea, the Ottoman Turks broke through the walls of Constantinople, conquering the Byzantine Empire. So, interestingly, while in the far west the known world of the Portuguese was reaching farther and farther, the Byzantines lost everything in 1453. But the situation would change with the arrival of an unknown navigator named Christopher Columbus. Columbus, having served the Portuguese crown for almost a decade, offered his services to the crown of Castile to reach Asia by sailing west. And, interestingly, when Columbus arrived on the coast, Castile was in the middle of the war to reconquer Granada, where the Catholic monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand were putting an end to the last Moorish political presence on the Iberian Peninsula. And the navigator, in this way, knew how to use this crusading spirit that was alive in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon to also refer back to the conquest of the Holy Land. In the biography of Isabella of Castile by Gilles Stremle, the author points out that Columbus, in his intention to persuade the monarchs to send his fleet to the west, he said that his adventure would help Isabella and her husband to launch a final crusade to recover Jerusalem, the Holy Lands. In other words, whenever the navigator couldn't capture the monarch's attention through greed, he invoked the spread of the gospel and the ideal of the crusade, not only to spread the gospel throughout Asia to unknown peoples, but also to obtain money and profit. In his attempt to recover the holy places for Christianity, Columbus thus used the desire for the unknown, mixed with the glorious nostalgia of restoring the kingdom of Jerusalem, in order to secure sponsorship for his enterprise, something he successfully achieved in 1492 when he arrived in America. And this has an even greater impact because of a detail that few people know. The Spanish crown is still to this day the heir to the throne of Jerusalem. After the establishment of the Crusader kingdom in the 11th century, and its fall in the 13th century, the claim to re-establish the crown of Jerusalem always remained with the kingdom of Naples. And, interestingly, when the great captain Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba defeats the French and conquers the kingdom of Naples for the crown of Aragon, the Spanish kings also become, by right, kings of Jerusalem. It's no coincidence that this title is still held today by the King of Spain, Felipe VI, and this title has accompanied the kings of Spain since the time of the Catholic monarchs. But the thrones of Castile and Aragon did not stop there in their ambitions to expand into the Holy Land. If the kings of Spain engaged in colossal naval battles against the Ottomans without any financial return, as was the case with the Battle of Lepanto or the relief of the island of Malta during the Great Siege of 1565. It was also because Spanish interest in the Mediterranean involved a future conquest of Jerusalem. In fact, a Spanish cardinal like Cardinal Cisneros led attacks on cities in North Africa, Oran, and emperors like Charles V conquered Tunis in 1535. The Spanish barely managed to hold dozens of cities on the African coast in the Mediterranean. They believed these would not only be bases against piracy, but also future footholds for a crusade in the Holy Land. But the Spanish were not alone in these ambitions. The Kingdom of Portugal also had claims regarding the former Kingdom of Jerusalem. Dom Manuel, a contemporary of the Catholic monarchs, sponsored the voyages of Vasco da Gama, who reached India for the first time, and also Alfonso de Albuquerque, who closed the Indian Ocean to navigation, Mamluk and Ottoman, and beyond the rivalry with the Mamluks. The Portuguese king tried several times to mobilize the Christian world for a crusade to the Holy Land. As the historian Paulo Drummond Braga points out in his work about Dom Manuel, at the same time, Dom Manuel I was dedicating himself to the long-dreamed crusade against Jerusalem in 1506. He sought the collaboration of the papacy, the Holy Roman Emperor, Fernando the Catholic, and the kings of France, England, and Hungary. Again, his interest turned to this matter in 1517, the year when the Mamluk Sultanate of Cairo fell into the hands of the Ottomans. Under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque, the Portuguese dominated the Strait of Hormuz, with the construction of the fort of Our Lady of the Conception of Hormuz, as well as the conquest of Muscat, the current capital of Oman. There, Afonso de Albuquerque built the Admiral's Fort and the Eastern Fort, where the Portuguese maintained warehouses, chapels, and military garrisons. In summary, the Portuguese brought the fortresses that existed in Morocco also to the Arabian Peninsula. And, in this way, the Portuguese dreamed of conquering Mecca, considered the capital of the infidels, and then the Holy Land, with fleets that would be unstoppable across the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. And the Portuguese had already started by prohibiting Mamluk and Ottoman navigation in the Indian Ocean, which would later lead to the iconic Battle of Diu, where 18 Portuguese ships defeated more than 200 ships from a coalition formed between the Mamluks and the Indian Sultanates. Thus, the Portuguese already had military dominance over the Indian Ocean. All that was missing were men to undertake the conquest, since the entire population of Portugal at that time did not exceed 1 million inhabitants. Although extremely powerful, the Portuguese were few, and for such an undertaking they needed many soldiers from the other Christian kingdoms. But as Paulo Drummond rightly points out, other demands of King Manuel's government caused this dream of a crusade to be postponed more and more. In 1517, the Protestant Reformation emerged, and even before that, the French were already arriving in Portuguese America to extract Brazil wood, taking advantage of the absence of Portuguese settlements in that territory. And, in this way, faced with the vastness of the American territories, the wealth that was being discovered, the conflicts that arose, and the greed of other European powers for these continental lands, the idea of uniting Christendom and financing a crusade to Jerusalem became more and more distant. In this way, as fascinating as the first contact between civilizations and the adventure of discovering the New World may be, the Crusader mentality, which was still very much alive at the time of the discoveries, is equally fascinating. Thus, interestingly, The greatest driving force of modernity was not necessarily the idea of progress, but rather the glories of nostalgia. And did you know about this claim to the Holy Land by the Iberian kingdoms? What surprised you the most? So leave your comment right now to support our work and take the opportunity to become a member of the channel right now. This gives you exclusive content access, so you can not only support our work, but also dive deeper and learn even more about the fascinating Iberian history.